Hi, everybody. I'm Mary, the OG Woo-Woo therapist, and welcome back to this week's episode, recorded in my functional but versatile home office that is 1 block from the interstate and where traffic noise is a real thing and can be disruptive. So I apologize in advance for any noise disruptions. And as usual, because it is possible for some people to use this information to self-help or diagnose, I have to tell you that everything I talk about today is not intended to take the place of counseling or therapy. It is only for educational purposes. If you relate to any of the information, do not self-diagnose or diagnose anyone else. Seek a professional to talk about it. And I need to give an additional cautionary note that it's important to respect safety through pacing and supporting choice. That means moving slowly, explaining concepts in a grounding way, and as always, you're invited to pause, skip ahead, or come back later. I encourage you to take the information in chunks. So when asking my clients about topics they thought would be relevant to a podcast or blog, one of my clients spoke about a sibling in their 30s starting to identify with autism and claiming to be on the spectrum. My client suggested that a discussion about autism and trauma dissociation would be valuable. In thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that many times people will confuse emotional shutdown from trauma and dissociation with autistic traits. So today I want to talk about emotional shutdown from trauma and dissociation versus autism. This is an important and nuanced question, especially because emotional shutdown can look like autism on the surface, and autism can include shutdowns. The overlap is real, but the underlying mechanisms are different. As a side note, I find it interesting that someone would seek a diagnosis of a spectrum disorder near middle age, but I suppose when there is a need to explain to ourselves the why for how we behave, a diagnosis would do the trick. Don't get me wrong, it is possible that a diagnosis could be delayed that long for whatever reason. When I was a kid in the 1950s, spectrum disorders were not a thing that got diagnosed every day. Not too long ago, I participated in a PhD student study on spectrum disorders diagnosed late in life, like after 60 years old. And it turned out that I have strong traits for autism, or a touch of the tism, if you will, which makes sense of some of my quirks. So I get how seeking a diagnosis can make things click for someone. They've been diagnosing autism pretty regular since 1980, when it officially became a part of the DSM-3 with specified diagnostic criteria. At that time, it was called infantile autism. Before this, many autistic children were misdiagnosed with childhood schizophrenia, mental retardation, or emotionally disturbed. None of those are preferred diagnoses and were not correctly identifying what was happening in the child's brain. Over time, the idea of a range of disorders was lumped together and considered to be similar enough that there became a range of symptoms or a spectrum related to autism. It wasn't until around 2013 that the DSM-5 officially made autism a spectrum disorder. A very important thing happened with that. They did away with the Asperger's disorder diagnosis. Everyone was now on the spectrum if they had any social or emotional management difficulties. But I digress. Now back to the topic at hand, which for trauma survivors is the more likely explanation rather than autism. First, let's look at the question, what is emotional shutdown? Emotional shutdown is typically a state response, not a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. It often shows up in trauma histories, especially developmental trauma, attachment trauma, chronic overwhelm, burnout, depression, dissociation, and high-stress environments. It is usually a protective nervous system response that sometimes results in dorsal vagal collapse. From a polyvagal lens, there is often dorsal vagal dominance or collapse and numbness, reduced affect, reduced facial expression, low speech output, cognitive slowing, and social withdrawal. It's a too much response, and the system powers down. It tends to be situational or episodic, worsen under stress, improve with safety and regulation, and have a before and after in development. Now let's talk about what autism is. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition present from early childhood and usually detected during childhood. Core domains include social communication differences, repetitive behaviors or restricted interests, sensory processing differences, differences in social reciprocity or interaction, and differences in nonverbal communication. Autism does not develop because of anything other than neurodevelopmental differences that are lifelong. Autistic shutdowns absolutely can happen, but they occur because of sensory overload, social overload, or cognitive overload. Or it can be a combination of any of the types of overloads. Autism is not a stress response. It is a different neurotype or neurodivergent. There are some surface similarities between emotional shutdown and autism, and here's why they get confused sometimes. Both may involve reduced eye contact, flat or limited facial expression, minimal speech, social withdrawal, appearing emotionless, difficulty identifying their feelings, sensory sensitivity, trouble with transitions, and burnout. But similar behaviors do not equal the same origin. The key differentiating questions are developmental history. Autism is present in early childhood. Social differences were always there. Sensory patterns are lifelong, and interests have been restricted since youth. Emotional shutdown is a clear change from prior functioning. It emerges after trauma, stress, illness, or burnout, and the person often says, "I wasn't always like this." The state is versus trait question is important here. Emotional shutdown is episodic, context dependent, can fluctuate within hours or days, and improves with felt safety. Autism is a stable neurodevelopmental pattern, not dependent on relational safety, and exists across contexts, even when regulated. A critical question has to do with social understanding, and this is subtle but critical. Autistic differences are differences in intuitive social reciprocity or interpreting social cues. They may miss implied social rules, and there is difficulty reading nonverbal cues that start in childhood. And a good example of this is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. There we go. Because he, in the casting, has Asperger's disorder, where he doesn't read normal social cues, and because we see him frequently when Penny or someone will walk in, and he can tell by the things they're saying and looking at the look on their face, not that he interprets the look, but he can see because he's been taught that that look on their face means that he needs to get them a hot beverage. So emotional shutdown is where the person usually understands social rules but lacks energy, access, or affect to engage, and may say, "I know what I should do or what I should say, I just can't." Additionally, there is the question related to internal experience. Emotional shutdown is numb, foggy, heavy, dissociated, and there is a sense of "I don't feel anything," and sometimes depersonalization. Autism is often still emotionally rich internally, may struggle to express or translate emotions, and sensory overwhelm may be prominent. And finally, there is the question of relationship to trauma. Emotional shutdown usually has a strong trauma link. Attachment patterns are often involved, and dissociation frequently co-occurs. Autism may have trauma, and it may be present, but autism precedes it, and autism itself increases vulnerability to trauma. An important overlap with autistic shutdown is that autistic individuals can experience shutdown that looks like trauma collapse by going silent, having reduced movement, withdrawal, and cognitive slowing. But the trigger is often sensory overload, social demand overload, or masking fatigue, not necessarily relational threat. Common clinical mistakes are mistaking trauma-based emotional shutdown for autism, missing autism because trauma is present, interpreting shutdown as lack of empathy, pathologizing neurodivergent social style, and treating dorsal vagal collapse as social skill deficit. Let's look at this through a polyvagal lens. Polyvagal framing looks at patterns, the nervous system, and core drivers for behavior. The pattern of emotional shutdown is seen as dorsal vagal collapse, and the driver is perceived threat or nervous system overwhelm. The autistic pattern is baseline, and it is not inherently dysregulated. And it also results from neural developmental wiring. The pattern of autistic shutdown is seen as dorsal collapse after overload, and the core driver is sensory or social overload. Autism is not equal to a chronic dorsal vagal state. A quick clinical rule of thumb is that if you increase safety, attunement, and co-regulation, emotional shutdown tends to soften. With autism, it does not disappear, but engagement may increase. A gentle way to explore this with clients is, instead of asking, "Are you autistic or just shut down?" try asking, "Has this way of being always felt like you, or did it show up after something happened?" Or asking, "When you feel safe and not overwhelmed, does this still feel true?" When it can be both emotional shutdown and autism is when some individuals are autistic, trauma affective, dissociative, and or burned out. These layers can stack where autistic masking leads to chronic stress, which leads to shutdown, which leads to misdiagnosis, which leads to more stress. In summary, emotional shutdown is a protective nervous system state, and autism is a neurodevelopmental difference in social, sensory, and cognitive processing. They can look similar, but they are not the same thing. They can absolutely coexist. Now let's look at a dissociation-focused formulation of emotional shutdown versus autism. When dissociation is in the picture, the overlap becomes more complex because dissociation can mimic autistic flat affect with reduced reciprocity, limited eye contact, literal thinking, social withdrawal, alexithymia, or emotional blindness, and cognitive slowing. But dissociation and autism arise from fundamentally different organizing principles. Let's consider first what dissociative shutdown is. Dissociative shutdown is typically a defensive response, a nervous system collapse, a structural distancing from experience, and state-dependent loss of integration. From a structural dissociation perspective, the AMP, or apparently normal part, may lose access to emotional material where the EP, or the emotional parts, may hold affect while consciousness narrows and executive functioning may constrict. From a polyvagal lens, there is dorsal vagal dominance, reduced facial animation, reduced prosody, hypoarousal, and a decreased orienting response. It is fundamentally about threat and overwhelm. Autism and dissociation are not the same organizing system. Autism is not dissociation. Autism involves differences in social cognition, differences in sensory integration, differences in interoceptive awareness, and different predictive processing patterns. There is no fragmentation of self-state or amnesia required for autism. However, autistic individuals are at higher risk for trauma. Chronic masking can create dissociative coping, and sensory overload can induce collapse that resembles dissociation. So the overlap comes from trauma layered onto autism. The core distinction is integration versus neurotype. A simple distinction is that dissociation equals disconnection within the self. In dissociation, something is walled off. Access fluctuates. Self states may feel discontinuous, and memory may fragment. Autism, on the other hand, equals difference in neural developmental architecture. In autism, the system is organized differently from the start. The person is consistent across states, and identified continuity remains intact. When internal experiences are compared, we see these things commonly reported with dissociative shutdown. I feel far away. I'm not here. It's foggy. I don't feel anything. There is time distortion, gaps in recall, emotional numbing, and the body feels unreal or heavy. This is often a reduced sense of agency, a sense of self-observation and detachment from the body. In autism without dissociation, the common reports are, I'm overwhelmed, it's too loud, it's too bright, it's too fast, I don't know what they expect, I need to retreat. Emotional intensity may still be present internally, and sensory input is sharp, not numb. Even during autistic shutdown, the person is still themselves. There is not necessarily depersonalization, and memory continuity is intact. Eye contact is a subtle clue. In dissociation, eye contact drops because orienting reflex collapses. Eyes may appear unfocused or glazed, and tracking of environment decreases. In autism, eye contact may feel intrusive or overly intense. It may require cognitive effort, and avoidance is consistent across the lifespan. However, many with autism have been trained to look at people when they are talking to them. However, it may not be directly in the eyes. It may be at the bridge of the nose. So it looks like eye contact, but isn't really. Alexithymia, or emotional blindness, happens because of different pathways. Both groups may struggle to identify feelings, but dissociative alexithymia is where feelings are compartmentalized. Access is state-dependent, and under safety, emotion may flood back. Autistic alexithymia has to do with difficulty mapping interoception or internal experience to language. It is a stable trait pattern and not necessarily linked to trauma. One of the clearest differentiators between dissociation and autism is distinct self-states with different ages, affects, or roles, internal dialogue between parts, shifts in posture, voice, facial expression, discontinuity in autobiographical narrative. That wasn't me experience, state-dependent memory access, and depersonalization or derealization are often common with dissociation. Even when subtle, there is a sense of internal separateness and internal parts with autonomy. Through the structural dissociation lens only, we see parts that hold affect, parts that avoid affect, switching between engaged and collapsed states, identity discontinuity, and trauma memory intrusions. In strictly structural dissociation, you do not see neurodevelopmental social reciprocity differences emerging in toddlerhood. Sensory processing is another important differential in diagnosis as well. Autism is lifelong sensory hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity to texture, sound, light, and pattern differences. and it is predictable and patterned. Autism amplifies sensation. Dissociation, on the other hand, is sensory numbing during shutdown, where there is reduced pain awareness, reduced interoception, and or sudden hyperarousal when triggered. Dissociation dampens sensation in collapse states and frequently includes amnesia, both overt and covert. Here is a clinical decision rule of thumb. Ask these questions. Was there a developmental shift? Are there trauma-linked triggers? Is there identity fragmentation? Does functioning improve significant with relational safety? And are sensory patterns lifelong and global? And are there memory gaps? If you see that there is memory fragmentation, state-dependent functioning, self-discontinuity, trauma-linked collapse, then dissociation is primary. If you see there are lifelong social differences, early sensory differences, restricted interests, stable identity continuity, when autism is primary. If you see both patterns, then you are likely working with autism and trauma. So in summary, dissociation is protective, state-based, fragmenting, trauma-linked, and alters integration. Autism is neurodevelopmental, trait-based, consistent, has sensory social differences, and does not inherently fragment identity. Overlap happens. Misdiagnosis happens. Co-occurrence is common. But the underlying architecture is different. The organization of mind is fundamentally different. There are some red flags that may suggest that autism is presenting with a dissociative disorder. When both are present, which is not rare, but also not common, the autistic child has experienced chronic misunderstanding, is socially isolated, encounters attunement trauma, and develops dissociative coping. In these cases, we may see neurodevelopmental social differences, plus structural dissociation, plus masking related to burnout. Clinical pitfalls when both are present are mislabeling switching as social inconsistency, mistaking protector parts for oppositional behavior, attributing identity shifts to camouflaging, missing subtle amnesia, especially in OSDD, overdiagnosing autism when trauma is primary, and missing autism when trauma is obvious. Below is a clinical case vignette illustrating how dissociative disorder can be misinterpreted as autism and how careful assessment clarifies the formulation. So here's the case vignette. The question, is this autism or something else? So initial referral question is to rule out autism spectrum disorder due to flat affect, inconsistent eye contact, social withdrawal, and rigid behavior. The presenting client is Lena, who is 29 years old. Lena was referred after a therapist suggested they might be autistic. The reported concerns are minimal eye contact, flat tone, limited facial expression, social exhaustion, difficulty with emotional identification, sensory sensitivity to noise, rigid behavior patterns, and periods of shutting down mid-conversation. Their intake paperwork included a history of childhood emotional neglect, possible sexual abuse, they have unclear memory about it, chronic dissociation, and episodes of losing time. But the referral question focused almost entirely on autism. So let's look at why autism seemed plausible. In session, Lena presented with downcast gaze, monotone speech, literal interpretation of some questions, difficulty describing emotions, and reports of masking socially. They said, I've always felt different, and I don't understand people. They described intense social fatigue and needing days to recover after gatherings. They also reported sensory overwhelm in crowded spaces. On the surface, this aligned with social communication differences, sensory differences, masking fatigue, and burnout. An autism screening questionnaire returned elevated scores, and the diagnostic pathway could have ended there. But something didn't fit. There were subtle inconsistencies. Across sessions, the clinician noted there were dramatic shifts in eye contact from almost none to steady and engaged. There were voice changes in tone and cadence, vocabulary complexity fluctuating significantly, sudden posture changes, different handwriting styles and journaling exercises, and emotional responses that seemed unlinked to present content. At times, Lena spoke fluidly and insightfully about relational dynamics. Other times, they appeared childlike, confused, and much younger. When asked about the shifts, they said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching myself talk, and there are parts of me that don't feel like me." This is not typical language for autism. Another clue is their memory. During session, Lena casually mentioned, "Apparently, I agreed to to a weekend trip with my friend, but I don't remember that conversation." They laughed awkwardly, and when this was gently explored, they revealed they were finding clothes they didn't remember buying, emails they didn't recall sending, being told they had conversations they could not remember, and gaps in childhood memory. They described it as, "It's like chapters are missing." Autism does not produce identity-linked amnesia. This was a turning point. As sessions continued, an internal system emerged. With stabilization and careful pacing, there was emergence of an internally critical protector voice, a frightened younger part holding sensory-based trauma memories, a highly competent social part who handled work presentations, and a numb, withdrawn part who surfaced during relational conflict. Lena began to map these as parts, not metaphorically, but experientially. When the younger part was near, eye contact disappeared. Voice became higher and language simplified. When the work part was forward, there was strong eye contact, a complex vocabulary, and an assertive tone. This variability was state-dependent and trauma-linked. Autism would use parts language metaphorically. The differential resolution rejects the autism hypothesis because it did not predict lifelong, consistent social differences. There was stable communication style, no identity fragmentation, no state-dependent amnesia, and no internal autonomous parts. And Lena did not have early childhood social delays, repetitive interest, persistent trait-level social reciprocity differences, and there were stable sensory patterns across states. Their social inconsistency mapped precisely onto parts activation. The dissociative hypothesis was supported by clear time loss, identity discontinuity, internal parts with distinct roles, trauma history, state-dependent functioning, variable autonomic states, and emotional amnesia. Further assessment supported OSDD without overt full amnesic barriers, but clear structural dissociation. This is where we would use the MID to clarify the dissociative diagnosis. Several overlapping features created diagnostic ambiguity, and this created diagnostic confusion. Without assessing for structural dissociation, autism seemed plausible. The decisive elements were state-dependent amnesia, identity discontinuity, internal autonomous parts, marked variability in cognitive and relational capacity, and trauma-linked activation patterns. These cannot be explained by autism. Once dissociation was diagnosed, Lena later reflected, "I thought I was broken socially. I didn't realize I was disappearing." So some points to remember here are that autism does not create identity fragmentation, dissociation can mimic social communication differences, and amnesia is a major differentiator. There's variability across sessions is diagnostically meaningful. Trauma-linked state shifts require a structural dissociation lens. Screening tools alone are insufficient. Diagnostic humility prevents mislabeling trauma adaptations as neurodevelopmental disorder. And by asking the questions, does this feel like a different part of you or a role? Do you ever lose time? And are there parts of you with different ages or roles? Misdiagnosis can usually be avoided. A good clinical heuristic or rule of thumb here is that if identity is continuous, memory is intact, developmental social differences are clear and lifelong, sensory patterning is lifelong, and parts feel metaphorical, consider autism first. If amnesia exists, internal parts feel autonomous, identity is discontinuous, and trauma-linked switching occurs, consider DID or OSDD. Well, that's it for today. I hope you find this information relevant and useful. If you did, give it a like and subscribe. If you would like to engage in discussion about any of the topics, please look me up on YouTube and engage in the community conversation, or go to my website at https://www. all one word, theogwoowotherapist.org. Thank you for being here, and I'll be back next week with another client-suggested topic.